Hello, humanoids. Welcome to episode 29, Climate Justice, in our course on philosophy and climate change. If you can believe it, this is really the last lecture until a wrap-up one. I hope this has been a good class for you all. Going to talk about climate justice. It could be a whole course on this topic, so we can't really do more than just try to give you some orientation so you can do some studying on your own. First, though, a note, look, what came in the mail? It's my own book on climate change. There it is. Pretty cool title or a cover. I like that. Um, so that's exciting. I thought I'd just share that with you. Okay, so Akbar, are you ready? Let's jump into it. Here's the deal with this lecture. My objective to begin an exploration of climate justice. And I think what's worth noting here is that when we talk about climate justice, we're framing climate change explicitly in ethical and political terms, which we have done really all along. But here we're really going to call attention to that. And I thought what I would do, because we do just have this one lecture for this enormous topic, is I would try to just set it within these wider context of justice itself as a concept and environmental justice as both a concept and a movement, and then touch on some of these more specific aspects of climate justice. So that's kind of the objective and the flow of this talk. So get as broad as we can here. What is justice? Talk about the oldest chestnut maybe in philosophic discussions going way back to the ancients. And indeed, of course, to the foundations of the human condition, trying to figure out how we're going to live with each other. It is a diverse, it is a contested term. You could say its meaning is contextual often. So I don't know if we're going to come up with some magic formula for this. Further, you could say maybe there isn't one thing that is justice as a concept. Maybe there's really just related things and they have this family resemblances. Or you could say there is a core concept here that runs throughout all of our uses of that word justice. If that were to be the case, and here I am using from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on justice, that and other things are in your resources for this week. Maybe a core concept would be this quote from Justinian: the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due, or her due, or let's say their due. That entry makes some good points about this. Again, you don't have to accept this as some sort of core definition of justice, but it's maybe a good place to start. There's four things about this definition that are kind of nice. It makes it clear that we're talking about how individuals are being treated. It makes it clear that we're talking about claims that can be made to someone or to an institution, and that might be the origin of our thinking about rights, these claims, about who, what has an obligation or a responsibility to dispense justice. So there you've got rights and responsibility kind of built into this definition. It makes it clear, or at least hints to this idea that you have to have impartial and consistent application of the rules, a constant and perpetual will, treating likes alike. And here you have maybe this concept of equality, which seems to be central to justice. And really interesting, you have to have an agent or agents doing justice, dispensing justice, or experiencing injustice. This agency, in the article it talks about that I'm referencing here, the Stanford Encyclopedia, it says you really can't talk about a cosmic justice or injustice. That's just luck or fortune. One of the examples they give is that it's unfortunate that a child is born, say, with a defect or a disability. It would be unjust if there were a medical treatment for it that was available and it was withheld from that child, say for no good reason, for arbitrary reasons, right? No, my little bar here, Akbar, is blocking me. There's so much more we could say. At the bottom, I put here one of the important distinctions in conversations in philosophy about justice is whether you have a procedural notion of justice or a substantive outcomes notion of justice. Do you, for example, if you're following along with the libertarian Nozick, do you want to say that unjust outcome, or I'm sorry, not unjust, unequal outcomes can be perfectly just? as long as the end result was acquired every step of the way legitimately and fairly, so that you could have wealthy people who have a lot more money than other people, but that can be perfectly just if they all participated in a marketplace where everybody played by the same rules, right? Or you could have a patterned notion of justice that might result from some procedural rule, for example, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Or you might even just have a substantive outcome notion of justice that says everybody should have the same amount of money, period, right? So there's just different ways of thinking about justice. That's the main point. Jump on to the next slide here. Environmental justice. I think I have maybe 4 points I want to say about this. Akbar's got to help me out here. Oh boy. Okay. Environmental justice has its origins, I want to say, in terms of something that's explicitly thematized, right, and advocated for in the post-World War II era, especially the 1960s. And it has its origins largely with the siting of polluting facilities. You can think about Love Canal as a classic example, and others. Typically, you have poor communities in the United States, communities of color, that are located next to polluting facilities or industries or waste deposits, right? That becomes this origins of the environmental justice movement. And it talks about, which we'll talk about with climate justice, disproportionate contributions to problems. So the wealthy people make more pollution, and disproportionate impacts. That is, the poorer people tend to bear the brunt of the negative impacts of that pollution. And that is an ongoing theme of environmental and climate justice. There are different types of climate justice. Two here that are often discussed in the literature under this notion of bivalent environmental justice is distribution. In other words, how should environmental harms and benefits be distributed? So pollution as a harm, for example, or let's say wild spaces, open spaces as a benefit. How do we distribute those? And also recognition, which has for a long time been more marginalized in the EJ, environmental justice literature, but it's growing attention to it. It's almost like a procedural notion of justice, the way I understand it. How do we recognize the voices, the interests, the perspectives of the people, and maybe even non-people who have interests at stake in whatever decision we're doing? So there's this notion of recognizing, platforming, including people, and again, maybe even non-human actors is an important part of justice. Two things on scope here. Who and what do we take into account? One of these questions is on the notion of a timeline. How far into the future should we consider the interests of individuals? And this raises interesting questions. I put in parentheses, for example, how much do we discount the consumption or the interests of individuals in the future? In other words, how much more do we say we want to put weight on the present moment as opposed to in the future? And then you have something called the non-identity problem. I put a link in your resources. It's a freaky problem. I won't spend a lot of time on it here. You can follow up on it. But basically, can you even talk about justice to future generations when our actions now determine who is actually going to exist in the future? So could a person in the future turn around and say that we treated them unfairly when if we would have done something different, they wouldn't even exist in the first place? Okay, that's always been kind of a mind bender for me. Another one on scope, I mentioned it. What about non-human creatures? Can justice take into account their interests? So other species. What about living ecosystems? What even about non-living things? For example, Mars. Does Mars have a right to be left unterraformed by humans, even if there is no life on Mars? Okay, a couple on climate justice here. First, more generally, questions that come up. Biggest one, back to those core concepts in justice, responsibilities. Who has what responsibility? Who and what do we need to take into account when we're evaluating climate policies? For example, again, future generations. In what ways do we take them into account? And how much weight do we give to their interests as opposed to the interests of the present generations? And can we even really quite know what their interests are or will be? How do we handle risk and uncertainty? In this context, I think we've talked a bit about the precautionary principle as one way of doing that, and that in itself is a contested principle. It's not quite sure what that even means, really. Okay, now, key central pillars, I think, of climate justice. There's at least two here. I'll give you three, actually, but the first two I think are really important. One, disproportionate contributions. Historically, we know the contributions to the problem, emissions from fossil fuel use, right, are unequal. Developed nations, and what do we mean by that, I think, is really important. The individual people, do we mean corporations, right? Who actually is responsible for these disproportionate emissions? But however you define it, it's undeniable that certain people have contributed a lot more to the problem than other people. On the flip side, disproportionate impacts, which we mentioned with EJ. Vulnerability to the impacts of climate change is also unequal. Typically, poorer folks, even women, people of color, indigenous communities, typically, okay, I'm talking in generalizations here, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and stand to suffer the most from climate change. That's just, I think, those are the central pillars. Now, there's another one I put here, intersectionality. I think climate justice is intertwined with not just environmental justice, but justice around race, class, gender issues. And I think that's because we're ultimately talking about the same or similar systems and structures and the way power is distributed within those structures. Right? Now you can, and there are philosophers who advocate for taking climate justice as a separate issue, if nothing else for reasons of simplicity for analyzing the issues, and I kind of get that. But I think at the end of the day, in the real world, climate justice isn't a standalone thing. It's part and parcel of struggles to try to think about and achieve processes and outcomes that are fair, right? It's a really hard struggle because it's complex. At the very least, it's complex. Okay. Now, we've also encountered climate justice already. You remember the SIJ framework that was uniting the left around climate change. A few lectures ago, we talked about standards, investments, justice. And in there, we talked about justice in terms of who stands to be harmed by both by climate change and by the big energy transition that we're trying to do to address it. In there, we said, well, probably three categories at least. Workers in general, who are going to see upheavals in the economy when those upheavals happen, both because climate change and the impacts of us trying to address climate change, they might undergo real instabilities. So how do we look out for their interests? Also, what about fossil fuel workers in fossil fuel communities? I kind of liked the way President-elect Biden put it recently when he said these are I'm paraphrasing, like the champions of the industrial revolution that did so much to advance our standard of living. And on some level, that's kind of undeniable. But we also need to move on to the next phase, right, of society, because we've got to address climate change. So how do we care for these people, these communities that got us through the industrial revolution? How do we have this, I don't know if it's post-industrial, because it's still going to be high tech. Let's just call it a ecological stage, hopefully, of civilization coming up. And of course, the frontline communities who are more vulnerable to climate change. And those are quite diverse. The other thing I just want to mention, this is both a moral imperative and a political reality. Taking account of the interests of these groups is the right thing to do, right? But it also has to be done if you're going to move legislation, if you're going to move policy changes, you have to think about the interest groups involved. So it just makes for good politics too. Now, I don't know if you caught Andrew Light's talk. That was, of course, just an optional thing. I gave you the slides for that. I want to just highlight one slide because the UNFCCC has in one of its articles this discussion or framework for justice. Look at it real quick. The parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind, so there's some scope, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Really interesting. So equity, as in not the same for everyone. But have you ever seen that cartoon where you've got a short person, a medium person, and a tall person, and they're all trying to look over the fence to see the baseball game? And if you gave everybody one box to stand on, it wouldn't be enough to get the short person to see over the fence. But the tall person doesn't need any boxes to stand on. So you could give the short person 2 boxes, the middle person just 1 box, and the tall person 0 boxes, and everybody could see the game, right? So I think that might be, I'm just reading into this, their notion of equity, but I think that's worth thinking about. But look at this phrase, common but differentiated responsibilities. We all have a responsibility to be stewards of the climate system of the Earth, but they're differentiated because of different historical actions in terms of who has contributed to the problem, right? And we have to think about our respective capabilities. Some countries, some people, some companies are just in a better situation. Look at Jeff Bezos with 10 billion of his own dollars, right, on the line for climate change. They just have a better capability to address this problem. Okay. At the bottom, it said, look, we also have to think about justice in terms of the physical properties of CO2. One, the historical emissions. We talked about this, the long life of warming by CO2. That means you have to think historically about what are the countries and the peoples who have packed in CO2 in the atmosphere that's still impacting us today. And 2, development needs. Let's face it, fossil fuels have lifted so many people out of poverty, and they're still doing it today. And so it may not be fair to ask developing nations to forego fossil fuels insofar as they're cheaper, right, to address climate change. So how do we handle that? We've got to think about the importance of balancing, well, not balancing, but we have to think about economic development, poverty elimination or reduction as part of climate justice. Again, that's why I think it's an intersectional issue. Okay, last slide for me before we get to Akbar's parting idea. Justice as sharing or growing. And this is, I showed you my book. This is kind of the way I think about it in my book. I say there's really 2 ways to think about climate justice. One is this kind of lifeboat ethics approach, if I can, that old Malthusian approach of a zero-sum game. Look, the Earth is finite, resources are finite, the ability of the atmosphere to absorb carbon dioxide is finite, like, unless it's going to go over some tipping point, right, and throw us into a different climate regime. This is the worldview of footprints, right? There's only so much space we should or can take up on the planet. And so really the only way, I mean, from this perspective, to achieve climate justice as some sort of outcome, right? And I think that's interesting. What does that mean? Giving everybody a fair chance, including future generations, to live on a habitable planet? Maybe that's what we mean by climate justice as an outcome. Well, maybe the only process to get there is degrowth, right? We've got to actually ramp down the economy globally. Now, that's a very heterodox view. I think the more orthodox, widely held view is eco-modernism, even though people don't call themselves eco-modernists, except for a few kind of nerds. We're all kind of by default eco-modernists, I think. Whereas it just means that justice will be achieved through growing the pie so that everybody can get a bigger slice, not by taking a limited pie and giving everybody a smaller but more equal slice, right? Think that eco-modernism is the experiment that we're trying, and it's based on this presumption of ingenuity that we will find a way to get to greener technologies to decouple our growing economy from environmental impacts, especially climate change. This is kind of the worldview of rocket ships. Like we're just taking off in terms of our potential as a human species to steward a high-tech, high-intelligence civilization that can be sustained, right? We have it within us to do this. So we may not even have to presume a carbon budget as if there's a limited budget, because remember, we're smart enough, we can come up with ways via geoengineering to suck carbon out of the atmosphere if we need to, right? So do we need to share the pie more equally, or can we just keep growing the pie? That's, I think, a central question. All right, I'll leave you there. With Akbar wondering, is it possible future generations will look back on us and think we were just really evil? I mean, we just keep chugging out these emissions. I don't know what it'll look like from the future. But I can tell you, I think we often look back on historical time periods, on people who probably thought of themselves as completely moral people, right? Good people. And we have some sort of different evaluation of them, right? Because of the way we think now. So I do think talking about future generations, what will future generations really think about us? Okay, I'll leave you with that one. Until next time, which will be our last time, may the force be with you.